They come on schedule. That is the first thing you have to understand about the Karath Dominion. Not their size, not their weapons, not the cold geometry of their warships against a daylit sky. The first thing you need to know, the thing that shapes everything else I am about to tell you, is that they are punctual. They have always been punctual. 40,000 years is a long time by any reckoning, but the Dominion does not reckon time the way we do. They reckon it the way a tide reckons time, without urgency, without doubt, simply as the inevitable interval between one arrival and the next. They swept through this system before. They took what they wanted from the third planet, left what they chose to leave, and departed on their long elliptical circuit through the outer dark. And they always meant to come back. They just never considered what we might do while they were gone. My name is Valan As. I have been watch officer aboard the Meridian Wall for 31 years. Before that, I served 12 years on a deep perimeter corvette called the Sullen Patience, a name I always thought suited the work more than any commanding officer ever admitted. Before that, 4 years at the Tycho Training Annex, learning to read sensor cascades and threat classification trees, and the particular brand of silence that passes for institutional calm when the people giving your briefing know something large is coming, and have decided the most useful thing to tell you about it is how to stand still. I am 56 years old. I have gray at my temples and a creak in my left knee that the ship's medic assures me is structural and not worth worrying about. I have watched this particular corner of low Earth orbit for longer than most people in the Defense Directorate have been alive. I was on watch when they came back. Let me tell you what the Meridian Wall is, because you will need that picture in your mind before anything else makes sense. It is not a station in the way the old orbital stations were stations, cylinders of metal and glass, rotating, fragile, dependent. The wall is 240 kilometers of continuous fortified superstructure in an equatorial orbit at 1,100 kilometers altitude. It was built over a period of 80 years. It has 6 primary weapons decks, 4 dedicated targeting arrays, 18 launch corridors, and a crew complement of 9,000 on any given rotation. It was designed by engineers who studied every record of every Karath passage through this system that our archaeologists could dig out of the rock, cross-referenced against the orbital mechanics projections that told us, within a margin of a few hundred years, when the Dominion's long ellipse would bring them back to us. Those records go back farther than most people think. The Karath were not subtle about their first visit. They left marks. Not in stone. They are not a species that carves monuments, but in the distribution of iridium in certain sediment layers, in the anomalous geometric regularity of several deep-sea thermal columns that match no known volcanic pattern, and in the oral traditions of a dozen cultures across 4 continents that describe, in remarkably consistent terms, vast objects in the sky and things that came down from them and collected and departed. The historians argued for centuries about what those records meant. The physicists who ran the orbital projections stopped arguing about it somewhere around 800 years ago. After that, it was simply a question of how much time remained and what we intended to do with it. The answer, it turned out, was everything. I want to be careful here. I am aware of the versions of this story that paint humanity as a species of desperate survivors who scraped together some improbable last defense and threw it against an enemy with teeth and grit and the righteous fury of the wronged. That is not what happened. That story is comfortable and it is wrong. We were not desperate. We were not improvising. By the time I was born, the Meridian Wall already had 4 completed decks. By the time I enrolled at Tycho, Earth's surface was ringed with 1,160 autonomous defense nodes, and the deep-range warship grid had been operational for a generation. The work was not heroic in the way that stories require heroism to look. It was methodical, bureaucratic, even. There were procurement cycles and budget reviews and interdirectorate arguments about armor plating specifications that lasted longer than some small wars. The people who built the wall did not feel heroic. They felt like engineers. They felt like planners. They felt, most days, like people who had chosen a very large and very slow project and were determined to see it through. That discipline, that willingness to do the quiet work across generations, to keep building when the thing you were building against was 40,000 years away and wouldn't become a sensor contact for another 800, that is what I want you to understand. Not the weapons, not the tonnage, the patience. Humanity looked at the evidence of what the Kareth had done, and what the orbital projections said the Kareth would do again, and decided, not this time, and then went to work, for 800 years, without drama. That is what I was the end product of. That is what I stood inside when they came back. The Dominion's entry into the outer system was not subtle either. They came in the old configuration, a Tribune-class command hull at the center, flanked by 6 grain ships, which is what our analysts had started calling the large-capacity haulers that traveled with every Kareth sweep. The name was apt in a grim way. Those ships were built to carry away whatever the Dominion considered worth collecting from a vassal world. Behind the grain ships came a dispersed screen of 4 escort frigates, smaller and faster, designed to manage anything a primitive planetary surface might produce in the way of resistance. It was the same configuration our deep-record analysts had reconstructed from the sediment layer evidence of the previous passage. They hadn't changed the arrangement at all. I found that interesting when the long-range arrays gave me the first solid contact. I stood at my console on the wall's primary watch deck and looked at the disposition of those ships, the spacing, the angles, the escort coverage pattern, and I thought, they designed that formation for a world that couldn't fight back. They haven't updated it. They came back expecting the same problem they left. That is not precisely arrogance. I have thought about this a great deal in the years since, and I think it is something more like institutional momentum. The Kareth Dominion is very old enough that the interval of 40,000 years probably registers to their long memory archives the same way a generation registers to us. A long time, certainly, but not a span that tends to produce fundamental surprises. Stars don't change in 40,000 years. Gas giants don't change. Asteroid belts don't change. Why would a single inhabited world in a minor system at the edge of a secondary arm change in any way that mattered? Because we were already changing when they left. That is the answer, and they didn't look back long enough to see it starting. First contact came at approximately 1100 hours, ship time, on the 42nd day of what the Directorate was calling the Kareth approach window, the 300-day interval that the orbital projections had bracketed as the period of likely arrival, accurate to within a margin that would have seemed miraculous to the projectors who first calculated it 8 centuries ago. I was on the primary watch deck. My second-tier officer, Marit Sol, was at the targeting console 3 meters to my left. The duty crew, 31 people, were at their stations. The wall was at approach condition 2, which meant weapons warm, shields nominal, communication arrays tuned to the frequencies our analysts believed the Kareth used for long-range hailing. They came in on exactly those frequencies. The first transmission was on the old submission band, a carrier signal we'd reconstructed from the acoustic residue embedded in certain crystalline mineral formations on the southern continent, formations that our geologists had initially classified as volcanic, until someone looked at the frequency patterns more carefully. It was not language, not exactly. It was a tone sequence that our linguists had spent 60 years analyzing and had concluded was the Kareth equivalent of a demand for acknowledgement, the broadcast equivalent of a hand held out, palm up, waiting for someone to fill it. I let it run for 30 seconds without responding. Marit looked across at me. She had the habit, when waiting, of holding her stylus in both hands and turning it end over end, very slowly, without looking at it. She was doing that now. "Sir," she said. "I know," I said. "Let them wait another minute." I was not being dramatic. I was checking the passive sensor returns from the deep range grid. The Dominion ships had not changed their approach vector. They were still coming in on the old track, the same inbound trajectory the sediment records had let our projectors reconstruct. They were using the same entry angle they had used 40,000 years ago. They had updated nothing. I thought about all the people who would never see this day. The engineers who had finished the first weapons deck and then died of old age before the second was complete. The admirals who had run simulation after simulation of this approach vector and written long papers about defensive disposition that no one outside the directorate ever read. The thousands of crew members who had served rotations on the wall over its 80-year construction and the 200 years since completion, standing watch against a contact that was always somewhere between hundreds of years and decades away, never close, never easy to make feel real. My own watch chief when I was first assigned here, an old woman named Dassler who had told me on my third day, "The ship you're standing on was built for one specific purpose, not general defense, not patrol, one purpose, don't forget that." She had been dead for 19 years. I thought about her when I keyed the hailing frequency. "Kareth Dominion vessel," I said. "This is Watch Officer Valen As, Meridian Defense Command, Earth Orbital Station. You are in the approach corridor of a defended world. Please state your purpose." I said it in standard directorate communication protocol, clipped, formal, without inflection. Then I waited. The signal lag from their current position was roughly 40 seconds each way. I had 80 seconds to look at the approach formation again and think about what I was looking at. The Tribune-class hull at the center of their formation was, by our estimates, approximately 4 kilometers long. The grain ships were smaller, perhaps 2 kilometers each, wide-bodied, built for volume rather than speed. The escort frigates were the fastest things in their formation, and our projections rated them at capabilities that would have been genuinely dangerous to anything Earth could have fielded 300 years ago. I had a targeting solution on all 11 ships. I had had one since they crossed the outer marker at what our arrays call the Kareth contact threshold, a line we drew in the system 200 years ago and have been watching ever since. I had not needed to do anything special to acquire that solution. The wall's tracking system had built it automatically. The moment the first passive sensor return came back with a Kareth hull signature. The reply came back in 83 seconds. The voice, if voice is the right word for it. The Kareth communicate in a register that sits at the low edge of human audible range, with harmonic layers above and below that our translation protocols have to strip and reconstruct, was measured, authoritative, and carried that particular texture of assumed command that I had spent a long time reading about in analysis briefings, and was now hearing for the first time live. It said, in the translation our system rendered in real time, "Acknowledge receipt. Kareth 7th Reclamation Fleet, Tribune commanding vessel enduring harvest. We are in return transit to the third planet of this system for scheduled reclamation. Prepare ground surface receiving coordinates. Anticipated arrival, 14 of your planetary rotations." Acknowledge. There it was, scheduled reclamation. 14 days, prepare receiving coordinates. Merritt set her stylus down on the console, very carefully. Around the watch deck, I could hear the duty crew being very still. I sat with the transmission for a moment. I was not angry. I want to be precise about my own state of mind because I think it matters. I was not angry, and I was not frightened, and I was not exhilarated. What I was, sitting in the watch officer's chair on the Meridian wall, looking at 11 Kareth ships on my sensor screen, was settled. Calm in the way that comes not from certainty that nothing will go wrong, but from certainty that you have prepared for everything that might. I had spent 31 years on this station. I had read every analysis briefing, every projection update, every tactical estimate. I had run more simulations of this specific approach than I could count. And now, the thing we had been building toward for 8 centuries was happening, in real time on my watch. I keyed the channel again. Kareth 7th Reclamation Fleet, Tribune Commanding Vessel Enduring Harvest. This is Watch Officer Valen As, Meridian Defense Command. I want to make sure I have understood your transmission correctly. You are stating that you intend to approach and access the third planet of this system, Earth, for what you are calling a scheduled reclamation. Is that a correct summary of your intent? 80 seconds, 83 on the return. Confirmed. Third planet reclamation is a standing Dominion protocol. This system was last visited 41,000 years ago by your calendar reckoning. Protocol provides for return at the close of the reclamation cycle. We are closing that cycle. This is not a hostile action. It is an administrative one. Prepare receiving coordinates. I let the silence on the watch deck hold for a moment after the translation finished. Then I said to the duty crew in general, not to anyone in particular, administrative, just that, just the word. Someone at a back console made a sound that was not quite a laugh and was disciplined immediately. I keyed the channel. Tribune, I need to share some information with you that may be relevant to your planning. We have been aware of the projected timing of your return for approximately 800 years. During that interval, Earth has made several changes to its situation that were not present during your previous visit. Before you complete your approach, I would like to walk you through those changes. I would recommend you hold your current position while we have this conversation. Watch Officer As out. 83 seconds, 101 on the return. Your transmission contains apparent inaccuracies. The interval since last Dominion reclamation of this system is 41,000 years. You cannot have known of our return for 800 years. Clarify. I opened the targeting display on my secondary screen. It showed all 11 ships, green-coded, solutions locked, updated every 3 seconds by the wall's tracking system. I looked at it for a moment, and then I minimized it. I didn't need it in front of me to remember it was there. Tribune, I'll clarify certainly. 800 years ago, our orbital projectors, the scientists who model the movement of objects in this system, calculated the approximate timing of your return from the data left by your previous visit. We have been preparing since that point. I'll describe what that preparation produced. The structure you are currently detecting on sensors, the large orbital installation in equatorial Earth orbit, is called the Meridian Wall. It is a dedicated defense platform, built specifically for this return. Its construction took 80 years. It has been operational for approximately 2 centuries. Are you receiving sensor data on its configuration? The pause before the return transmission was longer than the signal lag accounted for. 140 seconds, not 83. We are receiving sensor data. Your installation is larger than projected for a Class 2 developmental world. Confirm its function. Defense, Tribune, exclusively. It was built to meet your return and to decline your reclamation protocol. Now, if you will bear with me, I would like to describe some of the other preparations we have made, because the wall is not the only one. I pulled up the standard briefing display that the Directorate had prepared for exactly this exchange. Not because I needed it, I knew the material as well as I knew my own face, but because I had been told by the strategic communications officers who had spent 30 years preparing for this conversation that having the visual anchors in front of me would help me pace it. They were right. I looked at the first line of the brief and began. The Meridian Wall is supported by a deep-range warship grid. Earth currently operates 314 capital warships in an orbital dispersal pattern, extending from low Earth orbit to the inner asteroid belt. Those ships are not assembled in a defensive cluster. They are distributed to ensure that any approach vector to Earth is covered by at least 40 independent weapons platforms at any given time. Your current approach vector is covered by 57. The deep-range grid has been operational for over a generation. Its crews are trained, rotated, and ready. Longer pause, 191 seconds. Watch Officer, Your transmission describes a military capability inconsistent with the developmental record of this system. Our last survey classified this world as prestellar, with no orbital capability. We acknowledge anomalous sensor returns from your installation and from multiple objects in your inner system. We are requesting clarification on the origin of these objects. They are ours, Tribune, built here in this system over the past 8 centuries. I can provide construction records if that would be useful. They won't change what the sensor returns are showing you, but I understand the need to verify. I paused. I also want to mention the planetary defense nodes. Earth's surface and upper atmosphere are covered by 1,160 autonomous defense installations. They are interconnected, so that engaging one does not degrade the others. It prompts a coordinated response from all adjacent nodes. They were designed to address the possibility that a Kareth approach might attempt to bypass the orbital layer and attempt direct surface access. I want you to know they exist and what their function is. The pause was very long this time. I watched the signal lag counter on my display. When the transmission came back, the register of the voice had changed slightly. Still authoritative, the Kareth do not shed authority easily, but something in the harmonic layers underneath was different. Our translator's emotion inference protocol, which I had never trusted particularly and had never particularly needed until now, flagged it as reassessment in progress. Watch Officer Oss. You are claiming an 8th century preparation for this return. You are claiming orbital weapons platforms, distributed warship grids, and surface defense coverage. We are receiving sensor returns consistent with objects of significant size and number in your inner system. We are proceeding with our approach on standard reclamation protocol and will assess your claims on arrival. Our reclamation mandate is issued by the full Dominion Authority and is not subject to negotiation with local installations. I had expected this. It was in every simulation. The Dominion's institutional structure did not allow for a tribune in the field to simply abandon a reclamation mandate on the basis of an unfamiliar voice describing unfamiliar things over a radio channel. There was a process. You had to get through the process before you got to the point where something changed. I understood that. I had 31 years to develop patience for it. Tribune, I understand. I would like to make one request before you resume your approach. I would like your permission to demonstrate something to you from our current position, a demonstration that will not damage any of your vessels and will not require you to take any action. It will take approximately 40 seconds to complete. After it is complete, I would like to continue this conversation. Will you give me that permission? The return came back in 104 seconds. State the nature of the demonstration. I would like to show you what a targeting solution looks like from this platform. Specifically, I would like to show you that we currently have one on each of your 11 vessels, that we have had one since you crossed our outer contact threshold, and that the resolution of that solution is sufficient to be selective about what we do with it. I want to show you this not as a threat but as data. You have been making your assessment of this situation based on the assumption that our sensor capability is limited. I want to correct that assumption before you make your approach decision. Nothing will be fired. Your vessels will not be touched. You will see a brief targeting signal on each hull. Your own instruments will register it, and then it will stop. That is all. 197 seconds. Proceed. I looked at Merritt. She was already at the console. I nodded once. She ran the targeting pulse sequence, a coordinated emission from the wall's 6 primary arrays, bounced off the deep-range grid relay nodes, touching each Kareth hull in turn with a localized sensor ping at the frequency our analysts had determined the Dominion's own targeting systems would recognize as a weapons lock signal. It took 38 seconds. Every ship in their formation would have registered it. 11 sequential locks, clean, precise, held for 2 seconds each, then released. When it was finished, Merritt looked at me. I gave her a small nod. The wait for the Dominion's reply was 312 seconds, more than 3 minutes beyond the signal lag. I did not fill the silence. The watch deck was quiet. I could hear the low-frequency hum of the wall's power systems, the way I always heard it at night when most of the duty crew was at rest and the secondary lighting was on. I had been hearing that hum for 31 years. I found it steadying. When the Tribune came back, the harmonic layers of his voice had changed again. The emotion inference protocol marked it: alert, elevated processing. Underneath those layers, something that took the protocol 3 processing passes to classify. It settled on recalibration. Watch Officer Oss, we received your targeting demonstration. 11 sequential locks. Hull coverage consistent with a solution capable of coordinated fire on all vessels simultaneously. A pause within the transmission, not a signal lag pause, a deliberate pause. You stated that your platform has been operational for approximately 200 years. Yes, Tribune. The return was 107 seconds. How long have you had a targeting solution on our vessels? Since you crossed what we call the Kareth contact threshold, a marker we placed in the outer system 200 years ago when the wall was commissioned. Your formation crossed it 47 days ago. 112 seconds. You have had a weapons lock on our vessels for 47 days. Yes, Tribune, we have. We chose not to begin the conversation that way because the Directorate's considered position is that a return visit can be managed through communication rather than force, if the communication is complete and accurate. So I am trying to be complete and accurate. You came back here 41,000 years after your last visit. You came back expecting to find what you left. I understand why nothing in your experience would have suggested otherwise. But I need you to understand what 800 years of preparation actually looks like, because it matters for what you decide to do next. Silence, 253 seconds. Watch Officer, you stated that your warship grid contains 314 capital vessels. Yes. And that your current approach vector is covered by 57 of those vessels. Yes. The others are distributed across adjacent vectors. The grid is designed to ensure that any reorientation of your approach also brings you into coverage. There is no approach vector to Earth that is not covered. 141 seconds. Watch Officer Oss. The harmonic layers had changed again. What I heard now, and the translator agreed with me, was something closer to precision than anything else. The voice of someone who has just finished recalculating a very large problem and needs to confirm the result. Our mandate is issued by the full Dominion Authority. A tribune in the field does not have the standing to abandon a reclamation mandate based on local conditions, however unusual. You understand this? I do, Tribune. I've spent some time thinking about your institutional structure. Then you understand that I cannot simply turn this fleet and depart on the basis of a conversation. There is a process. Yes, I understand. I want to help you get through it as efficiently as possible. Tell me what you need. A long pause, 344 seconds. When the Tribune replied, there was something in his voice that I had not heard before in the conversation. Something the emotion inference protocol took 4 passes to classify and then came back with a compound reading. Controlled, measuring, and underneath both of those, very far under, something it classified as gravity. The weight of a decision that cannot be unmade once made. Watch Officer Oss. Your installation and your warship grid, are they the totality of your defensive capability, or are there elements you have not described? I thought about how to answer that. Not because I was uncertain of the answer, I was not, but because the question itself told me something important about where the Tribune was in the process. He was not asking to find a gap in our defenses. He was asking because he needed to know the true size of what he was facing before he could write the report that would go back to the full Dominion Authority. He was asking, In the language of someone who has run his own version of the same calculations I'd been running for 31 years, whether what I had described was already enough, or whether there was more. There was more, not dramatically more, not a hidden weapon that would change the geometry of the thing. Just depth, the depth that comes from 8 centuries of overlapping preparations, each one designed by people who assumed that the layer below it might not be sufficient. Tribune, the wall and the warship grid are the primary elements. Below them there are the planetary defense nodes, which I have described. Below those there is a hardened planetary shield lattice, 17 anchor points in fixed continental positions, capable of generating a surface exclusion field that would prevent any vessel below a certain altitude from maintaining a stable approach path. The shield lattice takes 8 minutes to reach full power. It has been at full power since your fleet crossed the outer marker. Below that, I paused. Below that there is the deep mantle infrastructure. 40 years ago, the Defense Directorate completed a series of deep installation weapons platforms built into the continental shelves. They are not relevant to an approach from your current vector, but they exist. 382 seconds. Watch Officer, you stated that your warship grid contains 314 capital vessels. I waited. We have now resolved 112 distinct drive signatures in the inner system consistent with capital-class warships. We are still resolving. Our sensor systems were not designed to search for military assets in this density or distribution. Another pause. When you described 314 vessels, we believed it was a figure intended to discourage approach. A strategic overstatement. No, Tribune. It was the accurate figure. You will resolve the others as your sensor range decreases. I would suggest giving your analysts time before you make any further approach decisions. 219 seconds. Then, we are holding position. Thank you, Tribune. I stood up from the watch officer's chair for the first time in 4 hours. My left knee gave its familiar complaint. I walked to the observation port at the back of the watch deck, the one that faced inward toward Earth, not outward toward the Karath formation, and I looked at the planet for a long moment. The western coastline was visible through a gap in the cloud layer. The Terminator was crossing the Pacific. From this altitude in the early afternoon light, Earth looked the way it had looked from orbit for as long as any of us had been alive, calm, blue, unhurried. It did not look like a world that had spent 8 centuries building a defensive infrastructure specifically designed for this day. It looked like what it was, a planet that had done what it needed to do and then continued to be itself. I went back to the console. Watch Officer Oss, I need to understand one thing clearly. In all of what you have described, the orbital wall, the warship grid, the surface nodes, the shield lattice, the deep installations, is any of it of recent construction? Is any of it a response to our current approach, assembled after you detected us? No, Tribune, none of it. The most recent element, the deep mantle platforms, were completed 40 years ago, before we had any sensor contact with your fleet. Everything else is older. The wall is 220 years old. The warship grid has been in its current configuration for 60 years. The planetary defense nodes were completed over a period covering roughly a century of continuous construction. None of it was built for your detection. It was all built before you arrived, because we knew you were coming and we had time. The return transmission took 411 seconds, the longest pause of the conversation. On the watch deck, no one moved. Merritt had picked her stylus up again, but she wasn't turning it. She was holding it flat in both hands, completely still. When the Tribune spoke again, his voice was still level, still measured, but the harmonic layers underneath had resolved into something singular. The emotion inference protocol ran one pass and came back with a single word: reckoning. Watch Officer, I want to ask you a question and I want an honest answer. Yes, Tribune. In 800 years of preparation, in the building of everything you have described, Did you intend for this conversation to end in a battle? Is that what your directorate planned for? I considered the question. It was the most important question he had asked, more important than the tactical ones, more important than the question about the shield lattice or the deep installations. He was asking whether we wanted this fight. He was asking whether the 8 centuries of work had been aimed at a war. No, I said. It wasn't. The Directorate's position, the position that has been consistent for 800 years across every administration, every generation of planners, is that the purpose of the preparation is deterrence, not war. If we had wanted a war, we would not have given you this conversation. We would have fired when you crossed the outer marker. We didn't. We called you. We described our capabilities. We demonstrated one, minimally, because you needed data. Everything we have built was built so that we would never need to use it. That is the honest answer, Tribune. 422 seconds, the longest pause yet. Watch Officer Oss. His voice was very quiet, or as quiet as that low register gets. When our fleet entered this system on the old track, our survey instruments were calibrated for a pre-stellar Class II world. The readings we expected were consistent with what was here 41,000 years ago. What we are reading now, the wall, the distributed warship signatures, the shield lattice harmonics, the deep installation resonance patterns, these are readings our instruments are not cataloged to classify. We have been running classification attempts since the first returns. We still do not have a full classification. He paused within the transmission again, the deliberate kind. That is an unusual experience for a Dominion reclamation fleet. I let the honesty of that land without filling the space. Then I said, I imagine it is, Tribune. I'm sorry we couldn't give you more warning. We did try to call you on the submission band. Another pause within the transmission. What the emotion inference protocol read off the harmonic layers in that pause, I thought later, was more interesting than anything it had flagged in the whole conversation. It classified it as involuntary recognition of an irony. You used the submission band, the Tribune said. Yes. It seemed like the appropriate frequency to begin on. 319 seconds. When he came back, there was something in his voice that I did not have a clean word for, and neither did the translator. Something that was not quite respect, too formal, too careful for that, but was in the same territory. Something like the acknowledgement of a problem that has been correctly solved. Watch Officer. I am going to communicate this situation to full Dominion authority. That process will take time. You understand that our communication architecture is not designed for rapid consultation at this range. In the interim, I am going to hold our position at current coordinates. I am not going to advance our approach. I want to be clear. This is a temporary hold, not a withdrawal. The Dominion authority will determine our next action. Understood, Tribune. We will hold our current defensive posture, no escalation. If you need additional data about our capabilities during the consultation period, we will provide it. If there are sensor readings you want clarified, pass the query and we will answer it. We have no interest in this situation deteriorating through misunderstanding. That is noted. A pause. Watch Officer Oss. One more question. Yes, Tribune. You said your projectors gave you a 300-day arrival window. We arrived on day 42. Yes. Were you disappointed not to wait longer? I looked at the sensor display. 11 Karath ships, stationary now, holding at distance. The wall around me, all its weapons warm, all its solutions locked, every system running exactly as the engineers who built it had designed it to run. The 9,000 people at their stations throughout 240 kilometers of structure. The 314 ships of the warship grid, distributed across the inner system, each one the product of years of design and construction and training and maintenance, each one crewed by people who had spent their careers preparing for this window. And below me, the planet. 8 billion people, the great majority of whom had woken up that morning, made breakfast, taken their children to school, gone to work, lived their lives without particular awareness that the watch officer on the wall was 42 days into an approach window, waiting for a conversation. The planet that had built all of this, across 8 centuries, without ever making it the only thing it did, that had kept building and growing and changing even while the preparation continued, so that what the Kareth fleet's instruments could not classify was not just the weapons but the entire shape of what Earth had become. "No, Tribune," I said. "We weren't disappointed. We've been patient for 800 years. 42 days felt fine." The reply came back in 212 seconds. "I will contact you when the Dominion consultation is complete, Watch Officer." "We'll be here," I said. He closed the channel. The watch deck held its quiet for a long moment, and then slowly it breathed. Not celebration, there was nothing to celebrate yet. The Tribune was right that his authority structure required a process, and none of us knew what the full Dominion response would be. But something released, the way pressure releases from a system when a valve opens properly. The disciplined kind of relief, not the relief of rescue, but the relief of verification, of having done the work and finding it held. Merritt set her stylus down and looked at me. "Sir," she said, "permission to note in the watch log that the first contact communication lasted 2 hours, 14 minutes, and resulted in a positional hold with no weapons fired." "Permission granted," I said. "Log it exactly that way." "Yes, sir." The Dominion consultation took 19 days. I remained on watch for most of them. My commanding officer, Director Sevath, came aboard the wall on day 3 and reviewed the full first contact transcript. He sat in the briefing room and read through the translated exchange twice, top to bottom, without speaking. Then he looked up at me and said, "You offered to provide construction records." "Yes, sir." "Did they take you up on it?" "Not yet. But they asked 7 technical questions in the subsequent days that are essentially the same thing." He looked at the transcript again. "Good, keep answering them." He stood. "This is going remarkably well, Watch Officer." "I think the Tribune is an intelligent officer, sir. He understood the situation quickly, once he had enough data." "Don't give him too much credit," Sevath said, not harshly. "He understood it because we made it impossible to misunderstand. That's what 800 years of preparation buys you, not just the weapons, the clarity." He left the next morning. I went back to the primary watch deck and continued the technical exchange. The Tribune's 7 queries came in at irregular intervals, 1 on day 2 of the hold, 2 on day 5, 1 on day 9, 3 more spread across days 11 through 16. Each one was precise, focused, and revealed the quality of mind I had begun to sense in the first conversation. He was not probing for weakness. He was building an accurate model. He wanted to know the wall's power generation architecture, not its weapons output, its power generation, the engineering that made the scale possible. He wanted to understand the warship grid's command structure, not the tactical hierarchy, but the logistics chain, how you fed and rotated and maintained 314 ships across the inner system across decades. He asked about the planetary node network's redundancy design. He asked about the shield lattice's anchor depth and what material the anchor columns were made of. He was doing, I realized, exactly what our own analysts had done 800 years ago with the sediment layer records and the oral traditions and the geometric thermal columns on the sea floor. He was reconstructing, from the evidence available, a picture of what had been built and how, and why. He was trying to understand not just that it existed, but how it had been made by a species that had looked at the orbital projections and decided to take the long view. I answered every question fully. The Directorate had authorized complete transparency on all structural and engineering matters. The rationale was straightforward. The Tribune was going to pass this information to the Dominion Authority regardless of what we told him. The only question was whether they got an accurate picture or an incomplete one. An accurate picture was more likely to produce the outcome we wanted. An incomplete one might leave room for optimism we couldn't afford them to have. There was one exchange during the consultation period that I have not described yet, because it was between me and Director Sevath rather than between me and the Tribune, and it has stayed with me differently than the rest. On day 11, Sevath called from the Directorate's ground facility, not a formal briefing, just a channel opened late in my watch shift, when most of the duty crew was at minimum complement and the wall was quiet. He asked how I was. I told him I was well. He asked if the exchange with the Tribune had gone as I expected. I said it had gone better, in some respects. The Tribune was a more careful mind than the simulation models had projected for a Dominion field commander. Sevath was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "As, when this is over, when the formal outcome is logged and we know what the Dominion decided, what do you want people to understand about how it went?" I thought about that. It was the kind of question he occasionally asked, which was one of the reasons I had always respected him. Not what do you want to be said about it, but what do you want understood? The difference matters. I want them to understand it was not dramatic, I said. Not in the way that accounts of things tend to become dramatic afterward. It was a conversation. We described our capabilities accurately. We demonstrated one thing minimally to correct a factual misapprehension. We answered questions. The Tribune was rational and assessed the situation rationally and reached a rational conclusion. That is not a small thing. It required 800 years of preparation to make rational assessment the outcome of his process rather than force. But the moment itself was not dramatic. It was professional. Sevath said, "That's going to disappoint some people." "I imagine it will," I said. "They were hoping for a battle." "Were you?" I looked at the sensor display. 11 stationary contacts, green, solutions locked, the walls hum, the quiet duty crew. "No," I said. "I was hoping for exactly what happened. A conversation in which we were so clearly prepared that the conversation itself was enough." He ended the call a few minutes later. I went back to the exchange with the Tribune. The technical queries continued another 3 days. On day 14, the Tribune sent a query that was different from the others. It was not technical. It said, "Watch Officer, how did you preserve the knowledge of our passage across 40,000 years? What form did the record take?" I thought about that one for a longer time than the others. I walked to the observation port again and looked at Earth. The same view I had gone back to during the first contact conversation, the one facing inward, and I thought about how to answer it in a way that was both accurate and complete. Then I went back to the console and replied, "Tribune, the knowledge was preserved in multiple forms simultaneously, because the planners who built our memory systems understood that no single form is reliable across that span. The physical evidence is in the sediment layers and the geological formations, which are passive and permanent and do not require maintenance. The astronomical data is in our orbital projectors models, which have been continuously updated and refined by each generation of scientists who inherited them. The institutional knowledge is in the Defense Directorate itself, which was founded specifically to hold and act on the understanding that your return was scheduled, and which has operated continuously for 800 years, with its founding purpose written into its charter and reviewed annually. And then there are the oral and cultural records, stories, traditions, the accumulated weight of what a civilization tells itself about its own past and its own obligations." I paused. The redundancy was intentional. You do not entrust a 40,000-year memory to one form of storage. You use all the forms available. You assume that some will be corrupted, some will be lost, some will be doubted. You build in enough overlap that the ones that survive are sufficient. His reply came back in slightly less time than the signal lag would have required if he had waited for the full transmission to finish before beginning his response. He had started composing it before I was done. That is a thorough answer, Watch Officer. It is a question that deserves one. 3 days later, on day 19, he called. Watch Officer Oz, I have received guidance from Dominion Authority. I'm here, Tribune. The Dominion Authority has reviewed the sensor data, the capability assessments, and the transcript of our communications. Their determination is as follows. The Third Planet Reclamation Protocol for this system is suspended indefinitely, pending a formal review of system classification. Under Dominion Administrative Code, a system that has demonstrated organized military capability at this level is reclassified from a reclamation target to a brief pause, a contact designation. We do not have a standard term for a contact designation at this capability level, from a system that was classified as pre-stellar on our last survey. The review will determine the appropriate framework. Understood, Tribune. I appreciate you communicating the outcome. Watch Officer, another deliberate pause within the transmission. I have a personal observation, which I am giving outside of the formal communication. Please. The Dominion has conducted reclamation operations in 612 systems. In all of those operations, we have encountered resistance. The nature of resistance varies. Some systems fight, some negotiate, some attempt to flee. What we have not encountered in 612 operations is a system that built a structure like your Meridian Wall and then waited inside it. Most civilizations that perceive a threat respond to the perception immediately. They defend against the nearest threat they can see. They do not look at orbital projections and say, "We have 800 years, let us use them well." He stopped, the signal lag ticked. When his reply came back, he said, "That is a different kind of mind, Watch Officer. I wanted you to know that the Dominion recognizes it as such." I thought about what to say to that for a moment. I thought about Dassler, my old watch chief, who had told me on my 3rd day that the wall was built for one specific purpose, and I shouldn't forget it. I thought about the procurement officers who had spent years arguing about armor plating specifications that would never be used in combat. I thought about the corvette crews who had served on the Sullen Patience and the hundreds of other ships like it, maintaining the deep range grid against an enemy that was generations away, doing the repetitive, unspectacular work of being ready because someone had to do it, and they had decided to be the ones who did. I thought about the projectors who had calculated the arrival window 8 centuries ago and passed the calculation to the next generation of projectors, who had refined it and passed it forward again, and so on for 800 years, each generation accepting the inheritance of the work as if it were natural, as if building a planetary defense grid against a threat 40,000 years away were simply the reasonable thing to do. Which it was. That was exactly what it was. Tribune, I said, it wasn't a different kind of mind. It was the same kind of mind with enough time to apply itself. We had 800 years. Most of what we are is what we did with those years. 221 seconds. That may be the most accurate thing you have said in this conversation, Watch Officer. I've tried to be accurate throughout, Tribune. I know, that has been noted. Another pause. The Enduring Harvest and its attached fleet will depart this system when our approach hold is complete and the formal reclassification communication has been filed. Standard Dominion protocol requires that we notify you of our departure heading. That would be appreciated. It will be provided. One more pause, the last one. Watch Officer Oz, you have been at this station for 31 years, you said. Yes. Did you know, when you took your post, that the Karath would come in your service period? The projections had it in my window, yes. Within about 30 years of certainty when I was assigned, I knew it was likely. And you came anyway. I came because of it, Tribune. I put in for this post specifically. 30 years of waiting seemed like a reasonable investment. The signal lag felt longer than it was. We will transmit departure heading before we break orbit. Thank you for the communication, Watch Officer. Safe transit, Tribune. He closed the channel. On the sensor display, the 11 contacts held their position for 6 more hours as the departure heading came through, transmitted in the Kareth standard navigation format, which our systems had been able to read for 2 centuries. And then, over the course of a single watch rotation, they began to move. Not fast. The Dominion does not move in haste. They turned the fleet with the same unhurried precision with which they had arrived, and they accelerated on the outbound vector. And one by one, the contacts slid toward the edge of the sensor display's range, and then past it, and then they were gone. I stayed at my console until the last one dropped below the detection threshold. Then I sat back in the watch officer's chair and let the silence be what it was. Merritt came to stand beside me, which she rarely did. She is a side-by-side officer, not a stand-at-your-elbow one, and the departure from form said more than she would have said in words. "Do you think they'll come back again?" she asked. "After the review, after whatever the Dominion decides to do with the new classification?" "I think they might," I said. 40,000 years is a long time to hold a grudge, but it's a long time to change your mind too, and they're old enough to know the difference between a fight they can win and one they can't. I thought about it. I think they'll want to understand what they missed, how a Class II world becomes this. That's a question their archives don't have an answer for. What would you tell them if they asked? I thought about that for a longer moment. "I'd tell them it was ordinary," I said. "That's the honest answer. Every individual piece of what we built was ordinary: the projectors, the engineers, the procurement committees, the crews who served their rotations and handed off to the next crew and went home. No one of them was the reason any of it worked. It worked because we kept doing it, because every generation looked at what the previous one had left and added to it. Because the decision that was made 800 years ago, we are going to be ready when they come back, was treated not as a grand declaration but as a practical fact, and then we did the practical work." I paused. "That is very hard to explain to a civilization that wins through force. The idea that discipline maintained across 8 centuries is a weapon. That patience is a form of strength." Merritt nodded slowly. The Tribune seemed to understand it at the end. "He understood that it worked," I said. "Whether he understood why it works, that's a harder thing. You'd have to have lived inside it." She went back to her console. I stayed in the chair a while longer, watching the sensor display hold its empty green, and I thought about a question the Tribune had asked that I had not answered as fully as I might have. He had asked about the memory, how we preserved it across 40,000 years, and I had given him the practical answer: sediment layers, projector models, institutional charters, cultural records. Redundant systems for a redundant task. What I had not told him, because it was not something that can be explained simply to someone who has not lived it, is that the memory was not only in the records. It was in the work itself. Every crew rotation that stood watch on the wall was an act of memory. Every procurement review that funded another decade of warship maintenance was an act of memory. Every young officer who put in a transfer request for the Meridian posting and was told the work was long and the event uncertain and came anyway. Every one of them was the memory, made physical, made ongoing, made real. A species does not remember a thing across 800 years by writing it down. It remembers by making the remembering a thing people do, generation after generation, as naturally as any other form of work. You make the preparation the culture. Then the culture carries it forward without being asked. The Tribune had asked how we preserved the knowledge. The honest answer was, by becoming the kind of people who preserved it, by making that our inheritance and accepting the inheritance. Outside the observation port, Earth turned below, bright and steady in the late afternoon light. The same world it had always been, and nothing like the world the Kareth had come back expecting to find. I looked at it for a long time. the way I had looked at it on thousands of watch rotations over 31 years. Not with sentiment, not with the heavy emotion that civilians sometimes bring to the view, but with the straightforward appreciation of someone who understands what the thing in front of them cost and what it is worth, which are not always the same number, and in this case were not even close to the same number. What Earth had cost in the labor of 8 centuries, in the careers of people who served their whole professional lives preparing for a day they might not live to see, in the accumulated discipline of a species that looked at a distant threat and chose not to flinch from it. What it had cost was immense and quiet and mostly unrecorded. What it was worth was the view from this chair. On this day, watching 11 Karath contacts file off the sensor display and not come back. That was enough. That had always been enough. The watch continued. The hum of the wall's systems ran steady beneath everything, the way it always had, and the next officer would come on shift in 4 hours and take the chair and look at the same sensor display and the same empty green and begin logging the same data, and the one after that, and the one after that, until the next approach window, or the window after, or the one that came long after anyone alive today was still here to see it. The work continues. That is what the work does. It continues because it was built to continue, because the people who started it understood that the point was not the moment of proof, but the unbroken chain of preparation that made the moment possible. I had been one link in that chain. That was sufficient. That was exactly sufficient. And I was glad I had been here to hold it.